Hey guys! Tonight we're slipping quietly into a world of drifting tobacco smoke, shadowed archways, and the sound of spoons gently stirring in ceramic cups. You're walking down the uneven cobblestones of Istanbul around the year 1650, though the locals still call it Constantinople, if they're feeling poetic. The air smells of roasted beans, the spice of distant markets, and the sharp tang of wet wool. A light drizzle coats your turban, but you duck into a narrow wooden doorway beneath a carved overhang. Inside, there's warmth. Dim oil lamps flicker against tiled walls, casting soft glimmers on brass trays and polished hookah stems. The room hums with murmured conversation. A man in a brocaded vest leans against a worn pillow. Eyes closed, listening to a recitation of poetry, or possibly napping mid-sentence. You find a low-cushioned shuffle out of your slippers. Right foot first, please. And someone silently hands you a small cup of tar-black liquid. Bitter, earthy, strong enough to reanimate a camel. This is not Starbucks. This is history. And you probably wouldn't survive this place. Not because it's violent or cruel, though it has its dangers, but because the rules are obscure, the social rituals dense, and the coffee strong enough to make your bones rattle. One slurped cup too loud, and you might be exiled from the neighborhood. Or, worse, shunned by the old men playing backgammon. Truly, the worst fate. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to post your local time and where you're listening from. I always love seeing the global bedtime crowd roll in. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You sit perfectly still, cup warm in your palm while the city outside exhales. Here in the smoky belly of the Ottoman Empire, coffee is not just a drink, it's an event, a statement, a tiny porcelain revolution. But it wasn't always that way. A few decades back, this same neighborhood would have seen no such cafés. Coffee had arrived in Istanbul via trade routes snaking out of Yemen and Ethiopia, carried by merchants, pilgrims, and mystics. It started not as a street corner stimulant, but as a religious aid, a Sufi tool to keep one awake during long swaying nighttime zikr ceremonies. The kind that leave your head spinning even without the coffee. The first Istanbul coffee houses appear sometime around the mid-16th century. They aren't humble stalls either. They're social palaces. Large cushioned spaces with intricately carved ceilings, painted tiles, and whole corners dedicated to conversation music and literary posturing. In many ways, they were the Ottomans' answer to European salons, except these served less champagne and more concentrated espresso sludge. You recline against the wall, observing the rules of behavior. Don't speak too loudly. Never interrupt a storyteller. Keep your tobacco ash neat. And for heaven's sake, don't put your feet on the cushions. Ottoman propriety is like a velvet prison, soft, elegant, but always there. Someone in the corner begins a tale, part history, part allegory, part local gossip disguised as fiction. He speaks slowly with dramatic pauses and long sips. Around him, listeners nod thoughtfully. You try to follow, but you're also just fascinated by the rhythmic clinking of his ring against the cup. There's a reason why many Ottoman officials didn't trust these places. You can feel it. The way people gather, the way they listen, the way a room full of strangers can slowly over coffee become a hive mind. Some officials worried coffee made people too alert, too talkative, too thoughtful. And really, who wants a thoughtful population under an absolute monarchy? So yes, at one point, coffee itself was banned in the empire. More on that in a minute. For now, your attention drifts back to the room. Someone lights a long-stemmed pipe. The smoke smells faintly of fruit and cloves. A boy sweeps the floor silently with a bundle of palm fronds. In the far corner, two elderly men argue quietly over whether Alexander the Great was really Macedonian or secretly Turkish. It's both ridiculous and strangely urgent. The fabric of Ottoman café culture is woven from this mix of deep tradition, spicy rumor, intellectualism, and absurd detail. These are not just places to drink. They're theaters, debating halls, barbershops without the scissors, sanctuaries for the restless. You glance up. The walls are lined with books, and beneath the cushions are little inkwells and scraps of poetry. Many patrons bring their own cups, their own tobacco, their own chessboards. The regulars even have preferred seats claimed not by sign or rope, but by time and presence. Sit in someone's usual spot without knowing it, and you'll receive a silent, withering stare powerful enough to sour your milk. There's a small bell above the door. Not for customers. It's to warn the owner if someone official-looking enters, an imam, say. Or worse, a patrolman. Because technically, depending on the year and the current Grand Vizier's mood, this place might be illegal. But the law is like the coffee, dense bitter, and constantly being stirred. Historians still argue whether early Ottoman coffeehouses were truly revolutionary in content, or merely a fashionable distraction for the literate elite. Some say they were engines of rebellion. Others say they were just fancier living rooms with better upholstery. But one thing's clear, they spread like wildfire. By the late 1600s, you couldn't walk 5 blocks in a major city without finding one. And each had its own flavor. Some leaned literary, others religious, some rowdy, some somber. There were even seasonal cafés opening only during certain festivals. In the cafe you're in now, the ceiling beams are low. A paper lantern swings gently in the breeze. The coffee in your cup has gone lukewarm, but no one seems to mind. The conversation shifts to love poetry, then taxation, then something about a missing goat near the spice market. This is how time flows in Ottoman cafes. Not in minutes or hours, but in cups. You're still nestled on that same embroidered cushion, still tracing your fingertip along the rim of your tiny porcelain cup, now stained with bitter sediment. A second round of coffee has arrived without you asking, just the way things work in a place like this. No menus, no servers in aprons, just a rhythm of glances, nods, and silent understanding. But let's rewind time a little. Back before this cozy room, before the smoke and poetry, before the rituals and regulars, back to when coffee itself was a suspicious stranger in the empire. Believe it or not, coffee was once illegal here. Yes, genuinely. A capital offense depending on the Sultan's mood that decade. In the early days of the 16th century, when the dark beans began making their slow, jittery crawl from Yemen up into the Ottoman heartlands, they weren't met with enthusiastic slurping. They were met with fear. Coffee had a mysterious effect. It kept you awake. It sharpened your mind. It made long religious ceremonies easier to endure. But more dangerously, it made conversation stretch deeper into the night. And nothing terrifies an authoritarian system like a bunch of well-rested citizens talking about new ideas. Sultan Murad IV, let's call him the Buzzkill Sultan, took a particularly hard stance. He banned coffee altogether. Not just coffeehouses, but the drink itself. Drinking it could get you whipped. Repeating the offense could get you executed. And we're not talking vague. Maybe he died of natural causes executions. We mean beheadings carried out by the Sultan himself. Murad was a fan of doing things personally. And no, that's not a metaphor. He even dressed in disguise and roamed the streets of Istanbul at night, looking for anyone bold enough to defy the ban. The tales say he'd catch someone mid-sip, reveal his identity, and serve justice on the spot. Whether that's poetic legend or truth, well, historians still argue whether Murad's moonlit decapitations were real, exaggerated, or just very on-brand storytelling from cafe poets. You shiver slightly at the thought. Not from fear, just from the eerie silence that follows, remembering how volatile the status of a bean could be. Of course, banning coffee didn't work. It never does. People love forbidden drinks. The moment something is outlawed, it becomes cooler, stronger, better tasting. Cafes went underground literally. Basements, back rooms, hidden chambers behind market stalls. The smell of roasted beans became a revolutionary scent, drifting through alleyways like a whispered poem. But why all this fuss? Because coffeehouses weren't just drink spots. They were thought spots. And that's dangerous. You have to remember, in an empire that spans continents, keeping ideological control is a full-time job. Imams preached from mosques. Viziers ruled from palaces. But in the cafes, that was the people's turf. That's where young scribes, unemployed scholars, and retired soldiers gathered. That's where political jokes started, where petitions were drafted, where poetry became protest and metaphors carried knives. In one infamous case, a cafe regular recited a seemingly harmless poem about pigeons who nested in the wrong tree. Everyone laughed. Then someone pointed out the wrong tree might symbolize the Sultan's new taxation policies. The poet disappeared the next morning. And yet coffee persisted, not just as a drink, but as a symbol. You look around your cafe again and realize that even now, years after Murad's death, his shadow still lingers. Some patrons still lower their voices during political talk. Some cafes hang discreet charms by the door, bits of blue glass, or Quranic verses, not just to ward off evil, but to signal allegiance to religious tolerance, or defiance, or both. There's a quiet respect for the bean. It's treated with care. The roasting must be done slowly over charcoal if possible. The grind must be fine, almost powder. Water is added only after the grounds are cooked dry, a trick that brings out the aroma. The resulting sludge is then spooned into small copper pots with long handles called sezve and gently stirred as it foams up not once but twice. You don't boil it. That's rude. You coax it. And while you wait, you talk. Or you don't. Silence is welcome here too. Sometimes the most sacred thing in an Ottoman coffee house is a long pause. Still, the authorities weren't entirely wrong about one thing these places did to spread subversive ideas. Some historians believe the rise of newspapers in Istanbul can be traced directly to café culture. People started reading aloud from handwritten news sheets, sharing stories from abroad, gossiping about court politics, satirizing the clergy, comparing notes on whose cousin bribed which tax collector. It wasn't just caffeine flowing, it was information. And so, the cycle began: ban, rebel, unban, forget ban, again. A jittery tango between the state and the bean. Eventually, saner heads prevailed. Later, sultans realized that trying to eliminate coffee was like trying to ban yawning. It just wasn't going to work. Better to regulate it. So, they tried that. Licenses, taxes, surprise inspections. Cafe owners had to keep one ear tuned to their customers and one eye on the door, just in case today was the day a patrolman remembered an old law and decided to enforce it for fun. You sip again. The second cup is even more bitter than the first, but also deeper, like a stew of ideas. You begin to understand why these cafes became addictive even beyond the caffeine. They offer a taste of freedom, a ritual of rebellion dressed up as relaxation. From this small ceramic cup comes a paradox, a drink that fuels empires and topples them, a brew that warms the body but unsettles the status quo, a liquid lullaby and an alarm bell. Outside, the rain picks up again, tapping gently on the wooden roof. Inside, someone tells a joke about the Grand Vizier's shoes. The room erupts in a soft wave of laughter, low, safe, shared. The kind of laugh that's been echoing through Ottoman coffeehouses for centuries. You're no longer just a visitor. You're part of the blend now. The rain has eased into a misty drizzle outside, painting slick reflections onto the cobbled streets. While inside the coffeehouse, everything has settled into a soft, steamy quiet. There's a gentle lull in the room, like the moment between acts in a play. A few patrons sip slowly. Others lean into cushions, eyelids drifting shut not from boredom, but from comfort. You shift slightly on your mat, catching the muffled thump of slippers crossing the woven floor. A man with a slate board under one arm sits nearby. He doesn't order a drink, he's clearly a regular. No need, the server knows. This isn't just about drinks after all. It's about presence, and here presence carries weight. Ottoman coffeehouses were more than meeting places, they were performance spaces, social theaters, and you lucky you are sitting front row in one of the most peculiar and politically charged venues in the empire. They say the empire was governed from Topkapi Palace, but sometimes you'd swear policy was drafted in rooms like these, between clouds of pipe smoke and the clatter of dice on wood. You lean back and observe. To your left, a group of men argue softly in Arabic and Turkish, too softly to make out the words, but the body language is clear. One gestures broadly, another raises an eyebrow. The third sips calmly, like a philosopher pretending not to be provoked. That's the thing about Ottoman cafes. Nothing was ever just conversation. It was performance layered atop performance. And when people sipped coffee, they weren't just hydrating, they were aligning with entire schools of thought. Over in the corner, someone unfurls a scroll of poetry. It's handwritten, probably copied from a more famous source, maybe Hafiz or Rumi, though the speaker doesn't seem too concerned with attribution. He's reading dramatically, his voice rising and falling like the tides. Around him, heads nod, eyes close. Someone pretends not to weep. This wasn't rare. Recitation, whether of religious texts, history, or fresh verses, was a staple of the Ottoman cafe experience. It was how ideas traveled. Not through books, many patrons were semi-literate, but through repetition and rhythm. Words like coffee were brewed, slowly savored hot, and passed from lip to lip until their origin blurred. But here's a funny twist. These weren't spontaneous performances. They were curated. Some coffee houses hired regular performers known as medas to entertain and, subtly, to educate. A meda wasn't just a storyteller. He was a mimic, a satirist, a human newspaper. He'd impersonate characters, replay court trials, rehash palace gossip, with just enough plausible deniability to avoid arrest. And yes, he might even slip in a parable about a lion and a particularly foolish vizier. Historians still argue whether Madaz were government-controlled mouthpieces or subversive agents disguised in humor. Perhaps both. The empire often found itself in this strange dance, encouraging culture while fearing its consequences, like a parent who buys their child a drum set and then wonders why they have a headache. You blink slowly, the coffee beginning to form a pleasant hum behind your eyes. The man next to you scribbles something on a slate, holds it up and smiles faintly. It's a joke, a pun on the word café, and kafa, coffee, and head. You chuckle, and he nods once satisfied. Across the room, an older man with a stiff mustache unfurls a carpet. Yes, an actual carpet. He lays it down beside the backgammon table not to sell, but as a surface to roll dice. He and his companion are mid-game, but they're not really playing to win. It's a social dance. A move, a sip, a remark about taxes, another move. In Ottoman coffeehouses, backgammon wasn't just recreation. It was a form of diplomacy. You watched someone's strategy, their patience, their response to a bad roll. It was quite literally a character test. There's a rule here: you don't gloat. You don't rage. You play, you nod, you sip. Even the act of rolling dice has a prescribed grace. Loud thuds are frowned upon. Dice should tumble, not clatter. Now and then you might hear a whisper from the nearby table. Something about land reforms, or an unpopular fatwa, or the price of fish in Uskudar. Each whispered word carries double weight, because technically these aren't political spaces. Officially. Unofficially. Well, let's say this no movement ever started in the palace. It started in places like this, with men in slippers and tea-stained robes, murmuring between games and jokes, with poetry that wasn't about love after all. And yet the government knew this too. That's why some cafes had regular visitors with rather stiff backs and watchful eyes. Informants, agents, listeners, sometimes regulars, sometimes just well-placed gossips. The goal wasn't necessarily to punish, but to steer, to listen, to keep the temperature of the street. Because here's another truth. Power listens more carefully to whispers than to shouts. You hear a spoon clink against a cup, and remember you haven't finished your second serving. It's lukewarm now, and there's a bit of grit at the bottom, but you drink it anyway. That grit, that's tradition. No Ottoman coffee drinker complains about grounds. Grounds are part of the experience. In fact, they're sometimes read for fortune-telling. Later, maybe someone will swirl your cup and tell you your fate lies between 2 camels and a broken sword. You don't even own a sword, but okay. It's growing darker outside now. The lamps inside are turned slightly down. The shadows stretch longer. No one's leaving yet. This is the golden hour, the time when conversations, mellow jokes get sillier, and the coffee starts to work its gentle magic on your limbs. Somewhere in the distance, a muezzin calls out. Not loudly, this cafe is near a small mosque, and the call floats in like silk. A few patrons murmur prayers. Most just bow their heads quietly. This isn't irreverence, it's rhythm. Ottoman life was filled with rhythm. The day moved between the sacred and the social, the spiritual and the secular, and somehow the cafe existed at the crossroad of it all. Your cushion sighs beneath you. A cup is refilled. A new backgammon match begins. And you, dear listener, are still a stranger here, but less so than when you arrived. The scent of cardamom wafts gently from a neighboring cup as the coffeehouse fills just a bit more. There's a rhythm to this place now. Not frantic, not sleepy either. More like the soft cadence of a tide coming in. Cushions shift. Beards are stroked in thought. The occasional chuckle ripples across the room, like a pebble dropped into still water. And then, the door creaks. It's not loud, but something changes when it opens. Several patrons pause, not in fear exactly, but in reflex. A man enters tall and lean with an embroidered sash and sandals too clean for someone who just walked Istanbul's muddy streets. He's not a customer. This, you learn, is one of the Bostons of the garden enforcers. Don't be fooled by the leafy name. These weren't florists. The Bostonse Corps was the empire's elite disciplinary force, responsible for everything from keeping order along the Bosphorus to policing coffeehouses for moral and political infractions. They were the empire's whisper collectors. And this fellow, he's not even trying to blend in. That sash is a giveaway. He strolls between cushions, slowly hands clasped behind his back, the picture of someone who knows everyone sees him. And that's the point. His job isn't just enforcement, it's presence. A reminder that the state sees all. That even here, under lanterns and among dice, the rules still apply. Ottoman coffeehouses had strictures, not just laws passed from above, but intricate internal codes, social customs, and unspoken expectations. But when the state wanted to make those rules crystal clear, it sent men like this. The man stops, says nothing, and sits on a stool near the stove. The room doesn't go silent, but the tone dips a notch. Stories get a little less bold. Jokes skirt closer to safe topics. Marriage reign why pigeons are the rudest birds in Istanbul. Political barbs are quietly sheathed for another day. Your neighbor whispers that, just last week, another cafe in the district was raided. Nothing too dramatic, just a license check. A few fines, one unlucky fellow detained for owning an unregistered hookah. But the message was clear. You sip your coffee slowly and try not to look obvious. It might seem like overkill sending agents to monitor cafes, but from the government's point of view, it was a calculated necessity. After all, a single popular cafe could serve hundreds in a week. Multiply that by dozens across the city, and you've got a communications network that moves faster than any official dispatch. The coffeehouse was Istanbul's pulse, and if the pulse got too fast, the Sultan's physicians took notice. Historians still argue whether these crackdowns were more about politics or morality. Officially, they were framed as religious concerns. Coffee intoxicated the mind, encouraged idleness, and led to scandalous behaviors like excessive backgammon playing or men sitting with their legs too far apart. The horror. But unofficially, it was about control. Too many minds gathering in one room, too many thoughts brewed stronger than the coffee. And then there were the illegal coffeehouses. These weren't tucked behind innocuous storefronts. They were carved into the backs of shops stashed in cellars or floated on the water in anchored boats. Secret spots with no signs, no official permission, and no rules except their own. You imagine stumbling into one of these places. A black curtain pulled aside, revealing a candlelit den of quiet rebels sipping in silence. A man leans over a chessboard. Another plays a flute so softly it might be your imagination. Here, the politics aren't just undercurrents, they're the main beverage. You hear about a legendary cafe rumored to have existed beneath a spice market. Entry required a code phrase involving pickled lemons. Once inside, patrons supposedly swapped banned pamphlets tucked inside hollow Quran covers. A poetic touch. Are these tales true? Some maybe. Others are just part of the mythos. The Ottoman Cafe wasn't just a space, it was a story factory. Every generation added a new tale, a new hero, a new disappearance to the bubbling pot. Still, there's no denying the empire tried again and again to control the tide. Coffee taxes were introduced. Permits became harder to acquire. Serving alcohol in a cafe was punishable by confiscation. And in some decades, even hookahs were banned for reasons no one fully agreed on. But you know what? Didn't work. Banning laughter. And Ottoman cafes were full of it. Even now, a few brave souls start chuckling again, the presence of the official noted, but no longer looming. One young man pokes fun at his friend's slow backgammon tactics. Another imitates the Grand Vizier's nasal voice. A snort erupts. A smile spreads. The room warms. Because eventually, even the watchdogs had to acknowledge people need release. Need space. And the coffeehouse provided that a sanctioned space for unsanctioned thought. A room where ideas could gestate beneath layers of steam ritual and humor. You glance at the enforcer again. He's sipping quietly, now. Just coffee, no threats. Perhaps he enjoys the ritual too. Even guardians have favorite cafes. Your cup is nearly empty and you find yourself peering at the sediment left behind. It's thick and swirled like the residue of a dream. Someone nearby murmurs something about fortune reading and you pass them the cup with a sleepy nod. Why not? Your future probably involves another cushion and another cup. As the lamp overhead flickers slightly, the room exhales. You lean back, a pulse, steady head gently spinning not from fear, but from the curious comfort of knowing that for all the state's effort to regulate the bean always wins. And really, what could be more Ottoman than that? It's late now, though time inside the cafe moves in half sips and long stories rather than minutes. Outside, the call of distant night birds mixes with the faint creak of carts being pulled through the damp alleys. But within these walls, the coffeehouse still pulses. dimly lit and half-lidded, like a cat not quite asleep. You glance around again, taking in the easy sprawl of men on cushions, the soft whistle of boiling sezves, and the clink of brass trays being slid across the floor. Everything feels familiar now, except perhaps for one very noticeable absence. There are no women here. None pouring coffee. None laughing by the stove. None arguing about taxes or poetry, or whether the latest Janissary revolt will last longer than the last. Ottoman coffeehouses were strictly male spaces. And not just in practice, but in principle, in architecture, and in law. Even your thoughts hesitate before stepping into this territory. It's a strange absence. Obvious, yes, but also carefully enforced. Women, of course, drank coffee. They drank it at home, in courtyards, on balconies, and during the lengthy ritual-laden morning salons among friends and family. In fact, many historians argue that women were the true innovators of Ottoman coffee preparation, adding spices, introducing sweets, perfecting the serving rituals that men in cafés later copied with great flourish. But in public coffeehouses, number off limits, explicitly. There were, of course, whispers of exceptions. One tale tells of a woman in disguise slipping into a cafe in men's robes just to hear a banned poem read aloud. Another mentions a widowed cafe owner in Bursa who supposedly ran her late husband's establishment behind a screen never seen, but feared for her sharp business tongue. Historians still argue whether these stories are romantic fabrications or scattered truths, but the absence remains. And it's not merely due to decorum, it's about social control. You sip quietly, wondering why a space, built on conversation, would draw such rigid lines. Part of the answer lies in the very definition of Ottoman gender roles. The public sphere, the maram, was for men. The private sphere, the harem, belonged to women. And while this wasn't as stark or simplistic as Western caricatures made it, it shaped architecture, behavior, and yes, coffee. A woman entering a male cafe would be seen not just as bold, but as disruptive to the entire rhythm of the space. Her presence would make political talk awkward, force men to lower their voices, reconsider their body language. She would shatter the fragile equilibrium of performance and power. You glance at the narrow doorway. Still no women. Instead, they hover as stories. One man in the corner jokes about his wife's ability to tell fortunes better than any cafe mystic. Another recounts how his mother once told off a city official using only 3 syllables and a hot spoon. Laughter follows. Reverent laughter. Women in this space are remembered but not present. And yet, their influence seeps through the walls. You notice how the men talk rhythmic, looping, half-melodic. The same cadence their mothers used in storytelling. You note the delicate way the cups are handled, the way sugar is stirred without clinking. That's not masculine ritual. That's inherited grace. Even the structure of cafe conversations, the rise and fall, the exaggeration. The punchline bears the mark of domestic storytelling. Ottoman men learned the art of speech from the women in their lives. They just brought it here and put it behind a beard. Still, the absence remains. And sometimes it slips into jokes. You overhear one man recount a tale of a traveling merchant who opened a cafe with his 3 daughters. One played the lute, one brewed the coffee, and the third debated visiting clerics under a false name. The punchline. They made better coffee and better arguments than any men. The room chuckles, but it's a chuckle tinged with discomfort. There's something too real beneath the joke. You wonder if somewhere in Istanbul tonight, a woman sits on a rooftop with her own coffee, listening to the echo of male laughter rising from below. You wonder if she rolls her eyes or smiles. Not all restrictions are eternal. By the late Ottoman period, things begin to shift, quietly, slowly. In some port cities, cafes emerge that serve families' tourist-facing spots where men and women sip side by side, albeit at separate tables. And in the palace circles, women host their own lavish coffee gatherings with better pastries and far less tobacco. But the traditional coffee house, it remains a boys' club. And that exclusivity breeds a particular kind of intensity. You start to notice it in how men talk here. Not casually, but performatively. Each opinion is honed, each gesture calibrated. Because this is their one stage. The one place they can debate, joke, confess, and bluff without fear of domestic consequence or interruption. There's freedom here, but it's curated, bounded. The cafe lets men feel like rebels even while enforcing its own quiet tyranny. And you float through it, observing, absorbing, drifting gently with the steam from the next pot being poured. A boy leans over and offers you a date stuffed with walnut. It's sweet and earthy, and it softens the coffee's bite. As you chew, your thoughts linger on the lives not present in this room. The poets uninvited. The mothers who shaped these sons. The whispers from balconies above, unseen but always listening. Perhaps the real coffeehouses weren't these cushion-strewn dens of men, but the kitchens and courtyards where stories brewed quietly, passed from tongue to tongue in a different register. You raise your cup again. A silent toast to the absent, to the ones who taught the empire how to stir without spilling. The dice hit the wooden board with a soft practiced roll. You've moved to another cushion, this one near a worn table, covered in swirling scratches from years of idle fingers and sliding teacups. The two men across from you are deep into a game of backgammon. But here in the Ottoman Coffeehouse, backgammon isn't merely a game. It's a language, a ritual, a safe space for competition disguised as casual chatter, and sometimes something sharper. You watch the pieces move back and forth in rhythmic turns. One player smirks as he blocks the other's route, the kind of smirk you'd see on a man who's just made a clever joke, but hasn't said a word. The other raises an eyebrow. He doesn't take it personally. Yet, Ottoman coffeehouses were full of games. Tavla, that's backgammon, was by far the most common. Chess, too, for the serious-minded. Cards for the gamblers. But Tavla ruled the floor. Partly because it was compact, partly because it paired well with a slow cup of coffee, and partly because it was the perfect excuse for subtler things, like coded conversations. You see, not every cafe patron was here for amusement. Some were Janissaries' elite infantrymen of the empire. Others were clerks' taxmen or exiles pretending to be nothing more than old friends. Games offered a way to communicate without attracting attention. One dice roll, one lost piece. One seemingly harmless comment about how the black always blocks faster than the white, and suddenly you're talking about military deployments without ever using names. Historians still argue whether some games were pretext for espionage or just playful cover for deeper conversations. But there's no doubt that coffeehouse games blurred the line between strategy and survival. You lean in slightly. The older of the two players strokes his beard and says, "Every board has its own temperament, wouldn't you say?" The younger one chuckles, replying, "And some boards forget who's really moving the pieces." It sounds harmless. It also sounds like a critique of the Grand Vizier, or the Janissaries, or your cousin's wife's tailor who won't stop raising his prices. You're not sure. That's the magic. Everything in here means something, or nothing. Games in Ottoman cafes weren't just fun. They were performances of intelligence, and winning wasn't always the goal. Sometimes it was better to lose with flair than win with arrogance. Backgammon players had reputations to uphold calm under pressure, generous with praise, ruthless in strategy, but always polite in tone. That's the line everyone walked here. Be sharp, but not loud. Be clever, but never crass. Still, drama happens. You hear tales of legendary matches where stakes were quietly agreed upon a pouch of cinnamon, a favor with a district official, or one night of silence from the cafe's loudest gossip. And once famously, the loser of a week-long tournament was made to recite romantic poetry to a goat tethered outside the cafe for 7 nights straight. The goat was reportedly unimpressed. You can't confirm this, of course, but the story lives on retold with just enough wink to suggest someone's uncle really saw it. And here's where things twist again. While games were tolerated, even encouraged, there were still rules. A backgammon set couldn't be placed on a kuhan. Loud arguments over cards were frowned upon. And gambling, that was a tricky subject. Technically, gambling was forbidden in Islamic law, but the line between betting and friendly wagering was as fine as the grounds at the bottom of your cup. As long as money didn't change hands too openly or too often, most cafe owners looked the other way. Some, however, leaned into it. You'd hear whispers of certain establishments where the stakes climbed steeply, and fortunes were made and lost with the roll of 2 dice. These were places watched more closely. The Bostensi, the cafe enforcers, weren't fond of open sin, but what they really disliked was unrest, and games, for all their charm, could turn fiery. You watch as the older man rolls a double 6 and wins the match. He smiles not smugly, but with the weary pride of someone who's just outlasted fate. The younger man laughs and claps his hands, bowing slightly in defeat. No bitterness, no tension. Just 2 minds testing each other in slow motion. That's the dance. The loser signals for another round of coffee. It's an unspoken agreement the winner drinks free. The loser pays with dignity. Nearby, 2 other patrons begin rearranging their cushions for a round of chess. You can already hear the different tone in their conversation. Fewer jokes, more calculated silences. Chess was for the serious, the intellectual, the man with opinions on Persian poetry and strong thoughts on provincial tax structures. Still, even chess had its rules. Never strike the table, don't gloat, and under no circumstances should you refer to your opponent's sultan as a stumbling rook. Apparently that had caused an incident once, a minor duel. No one died, but a beard was singed. You chuckle to yourself as your own cup is refilled. The coffee's grown stronger since your first sip tonight, or maybe you've grown softer. The bitterness now feels like comfort, like an old friend who still refuses to sweeten their words, but whom you trust anyway. You glance around the room. Games continue, but so do the stories. One group is quietly gossiping about a scandal involving a merchant's camel and a stolen shipment of saffron. Another is debating whether the moon looked different before the invention of spectacles. This is the beauty of the coffee house. Serious or silly, everything is allowed so long as it's framed properly. The dice clatter again. Another game begins. Another round of polite rivalries. Another chance to say something meaningful while pretending you're only talking about numbers. You sip your coffee now slightly cooled and realize that here in the echo of game pieces and the murmur of practiced voices is where empires breathe. Not in the clash of swords or the stroke of pens, but in the pauses between turns. The room is dimmer now, yet somehow sharper. Shadows leaned longer against the tiled walls, and the lanterns glow lower as if encouraged to whisper instead of speak. The conversation softened to a hum, less animated, more meditative. And that's when you notice it. In the corner, sitting like he owns the cushion because he probably does, is a man in uniform. Not flashy. No gleaming medals or sashes, but unmistakable all the same. You recognize the posture before the clothes. Rigid assured and curiously still. A janissary. You've heard the stories. Everyone has. The janissaries were the elite infantry units who rose from child conscripts to become one of the most feared military forces in the empire, and perhaps the most politically volatile. They answered to the Sultan, yes, but over time, they answered to each other more. A brotherhood. A guild. A power in their own right. And guess what? They loved their coffee. Some of the earliest and most famous coffee houses were practically janissary lounges. They weren't just for rest. They were for meetings, rumors, and on occasion, plotting. You shift slightly on your cushion, trying not to stare. The man across from the janissary seems relaxed too. Relaxed, actually cracking sunflower seeds and telling a long-winded joke about a village imam and a goat that won't pray facing Mecca. The janissary listens without smiling, just watches. It's eerie in a way, how comfortable everyone else seems around him, but you quickly understand why. The presence of a janissary in your cafe could be a blessing or a curse. They brought prestige, protection, and connections, but they also brought attention, and occasionally trouble. See, this is where things get slippery. Coffeehouses were social hubs, yes, but they were also political fault lines. And the janissaries, well, they danced on them. At their peak, janissaries didn't just serve in the army. They were involved in guilds' taxation trade. Some owned coffeehouses themselves. Others used them as bases of soft influence, watching, listening, nudging the city's undercurrent like a hand stoking coals under a pot. And when things went bad, coffeehouses were the first to know. You hear someone whisper about the mutiny of 1622. The room doesn't flinch. Everyone knows the story. How a sultan tried to break the janissary grip on power. How whispers turned into warnings. And how one morning the streets ran red and the cafes stayed eerily quiet. Historians still argue whether the janissaries used coffee houses to plan the revolt, or whether the revolts began because of the cafes themselves. Chicken or egg, espresso or explosion. But one thing is clear. Every significant shift in Ottoman power had a hint of roasted beans behind it. You glance at the janissary again. He's drinking slowly, the cup delicate between fingers that have probably strangled more than one insubordinate. There's a small tattoo on his wrist, barely visible, perhaps a personal sigil or a regimental mark. His eyes are half-lidded, but you get the sense he hasn't missed a word spoken in the last hour. That's the trick. Janissaries were trained for battle, but they mastered stillness. You never knew if one was asleep or storing your name for later. And yet you can't help but respect it. These men, once taken as children, converted, trained without family or wealth, climbed into the heart of the empire. Not just through weapons, but through networks. Coffeehouses were their unofficial embassies. Here, a janissary could meet a tax farmer, a sailor, a merchant, a gossiping scribe, and walk out knowing more than any palace courier. That's why many coffeehouse owners courted janissaries offering discount special cushions private tables. Others, more nervous types, tried to ban them outright. That rarely worked. In fact, there are records of janissaries recommending that certain cafés change their decor or clientele. Recommendations that weren't so much suggestions as well-dressed threats. But not all interactions were shadowed in menace. Many were just oddly domestic. A poet nearby leans over and recalls a janissary who used to come every Thursday to play the lute badly and recite romantic verse to an audience of tired clerks who clapped only because they feared he'd stop paying for their coffee if they didn't. The room chuckles. Even power has its quirks. Still, the tension remained. A janissary could be your friend tonight and your accuser tomorrow. It wasn't personal, it was politics. The empire was always shifting, always tightening its belt or loosening it depending on how the sultan slept the night before. And the janissaries. They were always in the middle. You hear another story, this one about a cafe owner who refused to serve a certain regiment. Too rowdy, too demanding. He said no. A week later, his windows were shattered, and the rumor was that rats were encouraged to visit his flour sacks. He never reopened. You wonder what it must have felt like to operate in that space between respect and fear, between admiration and anxiety. To know your business depended on a smile from someone who could burn it down for fun. Still, the man across from the janissary continues his joke. Now several goats and 2 incompetent angels deep into the story. The janissary's lips twitch. A reaction. It's subtle, but real. You sip again. The coffee has settled into your bloodstream now. Everything feels slower, more vivid. The laughter, the smoke, the faint scrape of slippers on tile. You feel like you've always been here. And maybe in a way, you have. History repeats. Power shifts. And in every era, someone in uniform sits quietly in the corner, nursing a drink and watching the world unravel with a half smile and perfect posture. The air inside the coffee house has changed subtly like a new note in an old song. A faint hum has started near the back of the room. It's soft at first, the kind of sound you might confuse with the wind or a faulty kettle. But no, it's rhythm, a pattern, a heartbeat under the surface. You turn toward the source and there gathered loosely near a low-burning lamp are a group of men in flowing robes and loosely wrapped turbans. One has a small frame drum cradled in his lap, tapping it with fingers like drops of water on glass. Another sways slightly, eyes closed, lips moving in silent chant. There's a third older seated with his knees drawn up, gently rocking. Sufis. This isn't unusual. In fact, in many parts of the Ottoman world, Sufis and coffee go together like verse and melody. If janissaries were the steel veins of the empire, then Sufis were its gentle pulse mystics devoted to inner truth, divine love, and occasionally the strange miracle of staying awake through an entire night of prayer. And that's where coffee came in. See, while the legal scholars of the early Islamic world debated the moral and religious implications of this new dark elixir, some comparing it to wine, others calling it a medicine, the Sufis just drank it, practically and poetically. They discovered that coffee could help them endure long zikr ceremonies, rhythmic recitations of divine names spun into music, motion, and repetition. Hours and hours of spiritual concentration made slightly easier by a warm cup of bitter alertness. You watch now as the rhythm intensifies, not louder, just deeper, like it's moving through your bones rather than your ears. One man begins to chant softly. It's Arabic, maybe a verse from the Quran, or maybe just a devotional phrase. Ya, hu, dan dishans damri kunsterdwanin. Mandirbikin. Miao bikin jibibleke duyain. Nodakun once konsku guanski korbituarin. The syllables tumble forward like gentle waves. Coffee was more than a stimulant here. It was a sacrament. You see the reverence in how they handle their cups, always with both hands, always after a breath. A small sip, then silence, then movement. The entire ritual feels like a conversation with something greater. Sufi orders, especially the Mevlevis and the Qadiris, were early adopters of the bean. They brewed it strong, unfiltered, often with spices. Some infused it with cardamom, others with black pepper or clove, not just for taste, but for symbolism. Each ingredient carried spiritual weight. And while the state alternated between tolerating and policing Sufis, the people adored them, especially in cities. Their lodges or techies became centers of learning, music, healing, and yes, some of the earliest public spaces where coffee was poured with purpose. You glance around the coffeehouse now and notice how others have turned toward the group. No one interrupts. No one mocks. Even the janissary from earlier shifts slightly just enough to listen. This is something sacred. Not in the rigid cold way of law, but in the soft way of memory. Of childhood. Of old songs and warm cups on winter mornings. One of the Sufis opens his eyes and looks at you not sharply, not searchingly, just openly. As if to say, you're here too. You're part of this. And you are. Because in this space there's no sermon, no lecture, no hierarchy. Just rhythm, coffee, and stillness. And the room which moments ago felt like a stage for politics and rivalry now feels like a temple of breath. You sip your own coffee and realize it tastes slightly different now. Same grounds, same preparation, but your senses have shifted. Your pulse has slowed. The smoke no longer stings. It drapes. The murmurs no longer distract. They lull. But not everyone approved of this blend of caffeine and spirituality. You hear whisper stories of stricter scholars who accuse the Sufis of excess, of dancing when they should be kneeling, of drinking a substance that in their opinion bordered on sinful. And yet, they never managed to quench the ceremonies. Or the cups. Historians still argue whether the early bans on coffee were really about piety or just veiled attacks on Sufi influence. After all, where coffee gathered, people conversation followed. And where Sufis gathered, people politics sometimes brewed, however softly. You notice now how the rhythm has slowed again. The drum rests. The chant fades. One man begins to recite a poem not loudly, just enough to let the syllables bloom in the air. I drank a cup that burned the sleep from my eyes, yet filled my heart with the sweetest dreams. No applause follows, just nods. One man wipes a tear, discreetly. This, you understand, is the soul of the Ottoman coffeehouse that most visitors never see. Beneath the politics, the gossip, the games, there's a sacred undercurrent. A quiet rebellion against forgetting. A sip that binds body to spirit. The Sufis rise now, not all at once, but like reeds swaying together. They don't leave, but they melt back into the cushions, rejoining the café's quieter murmur. The music has stopped, but its echo lingers in the arches and the air. And you feel different. As if the drink you've been slowly savoring all night has finally settled in your chest, not as caffeine, but as calm. You look down at the dregs in your cup, swirl them slightly, and think not of the future, or politics or anything grand. Just of the rhythm, of breath, of names repeated until they sound like prayer, of heat and rest, and the soft hiss of a charcoal stove beneath a copper pot. You barely notice the shift at first. One man stands. Another casually adjusts his robe. A few guests tuck their legs beneath them a little more neatly, but then a name is murmured at a nearby cushion, half laugh, half warning. The owner? Ah, not the boy who brings the coffee, not the man who polishes the brass pots or counts the sugar lumps in the storeroom. No, the owner. The one who owns the lease, greases the inspectors, and knows which customer needs their cup extra hot, and which one wants to sit beside the stove but never directly in front of it. He walks in with the easy confidence of someone who knows 100 secrets and has no intention of telling a single one. He's not old, perhaps mid-40s, though the rings beneath his eyes suggest he hasn't slept through enough on their bum. Nina Zisnir, my Korean exchanger, Tater, in Windofinner, to which you witty rich fadir, Earbon jers. His weird robes are clean but not flashy, his beard trimmed, and he carries no weapon. Just a folded cloth under one arm and a small string of prayer beads flicking between his fingers. You watch as he glides between cushions, exchanging nods, gripping shoulders, muttering greetings that somehow seem tailored to each guest. His path through the cafe is like a surveyor mapping invisible territory. Each corner holds a memory, a favor owed, a story remembered. This, you realize, is not just a business. It's a kingdom. And he is its weary monarch. But not a safe monarch. Not at all. Because being a coffeehouse owner in the Ottoman Empire, especially in a big city like Istanbul or Aleppo or Cairo, was a gamble. A dangerous caffeinated gamble. The coffeehouse was a public space, but also a pressure valve. A platform for voices that could quickly shift from humorous to heretical, from poetic to political. And if the state decided that your cafe was the source of discontent, let's just say there were no refunds on your wooden benches. You sip quietly and wonder how many times this man has been visited by the authorities. Not just the Bostanse, but men in heavier coats, tax collectors, informants posing as regulars, a mullah or two sent to question the morality of his clientele. He probably has papers, permits, maybe even bribes pre-packaged in linen sachets tucked in a drawer beneath the spice rack. Historians still argue whether coffeehouse owners were true political agents or simply merchants caught in the currents of empire. But the truth is probably both. A good owner listened more than he spoke, remembered more than he wrote, and always knew who not to serve when the wind turned. There's a well-known story, a kind of folktale told in many coffeehouses about an owner in Edirne who served two rival officials from opposite ends of the imperial bureaucracy. They both came every afternoon, sat in the same corner, but never crossed paths. Until one day a storm delayed them both. They arrived within moments of each other. The owner, without blinking, placed their cushions at opposite ends of the room, served each the wrong sugar, and loudly told a fabricated story about one of them being called away urgently. The moment passed. A potential confrontation, possibly deadly, was reduced to a shrug. Was it true? Maybe not. But every good coffeehouse owner wanted to believe they'd do the same. You notice how this owner moves now. He pauses briefly at the Sufis' corner, offers a hand to the janissary, and takes a long look at the chess game unfolding near the back. Not judging. Just reading the room. Because the owner must read the room. 1 disgruntled poet. No problem. 2 still manageable. But 3 angry scribes, a drunk bureaucrat, and a merchant with bad debts all sharing a cushion. That's a situation. Sometimes owners made quiet decisions. They would lose a cushion, run out of certain tobacco, suddenly close for cleaning when tensions rose too high. And occasionally, yes, they reported things. It wasn't betrayal, it was survival. You could lose a café for the wrong whisper, left unreported. There's even a rumor that the empire paid certain coffeehouse owners to not host dangerous conversations. As in, we'll let you stay open if you politely steer the poets toward love poems and keep the tax collectors' names out of your room. It's believable. It's practical. It's very Ottoman. You notice now that the owner has slipped behind the counter not to make coffee, but to rearrange the jars on the back shelf. It seems unimportant until you realize he does this every night at the same time. It's a signal. Subtle. Perhaps for the kitchen boy. Perhaps for a spy. Perhaps for no one, but a ritual, once repeated, becomes a rhythm, others follow. That's power. Not the kind with swords or stamps. The kind that moves quietly. The kind that decides who gets a second cup and who gets told there's none left, despite the pot boiling full behind the curtain. And when a poet is arrested tomorrow and people whisper, "Where did he say those things?" the answer might be here. Or it might not. No one will accuse the owner directly. Just sideways glances. Just quiet cups. You finish your own drink and place the cup on its saucer just so. A tiny gesture but observed. The boy collects it within seconds and the owner glances over, not a smile, but a small nod. You've been seen, noted, catalogued, not in a sinister way, just remembered. Because in the empire of cushions and grounds, memory is currency. And tonight, you've paid in full. The lamps have grown warmer now, their glow deepening to amber like melted honey over stone. You settle back against your cushion and catch the whisper of a breeze sneaking through the door, carrying with it a mingled scent of street smoke, stale rose water, and the faint metallic note of distant rain. The coffeehouse breathes. And yet, for all this peace, the air carries tension too. Not from any one person, but from the history layered into the walls. You've heard it mentioned twice already tonight as a joke and then a whisper. It won't last long. They'll shut it again. You begin to understand this café, this haven of ritual and rhythm exists on borrowed time. That's the thing about Ottoman coffeehouses. They were constantly dancing between legitimacy and repression, like a flame flickering just beneath the reach of a censor's hand. Open one day, boarded the next. Forbidden this week, licensed the next. Tonight, it's open. But tomorrow, who knows? You've already heard about Sultan Murad IV's caffeine crackdown, but his was just the most theatrical attempt. The truth is, the empire never truly made up its mind about these places. They were both beloved and feared, the joy of the people and the headache of the palace. Sometimes the sultan would champion coffeehouses, declare them spaces for education, relaxation, even moral guidance. And other times, the same sultan would issue a decree banning them outright, citing social unrest or moral decay, or simply too much laughter after dark. Historians still argue whether these bans were effective or merely symbolic. Some say they were tools to remind the public who held the reins. Others claimed they were sincere moral attempts by conservative advisors panicked by the rise of public leisure. But all agree, no ban ever really stuck. Take, for instance, the Great Closure of 1633. Word spread fast. All licensed coffeehouses in Istanbul were ordered shut. Owners scrambled to hide their chaises, rolled up their carpets, and locked their doors. But within days, literally days, makeshift cafés popped up in private courtyards behind tailor shops in the rear rooms of hammams. You can almost hear the conversations. "Oh, this isn't a cafe. We just happen to have cushions and hot drinks." And a man reciting poetry. It's a kind of resistance, quiet, unarmed, brewed strong. Tonight's cafe bears the evidence of past closures. You can see the signs if you look closely. A cracked tile near the stove, as if something heavy was once dragged over it. A new back door installed hastily, perhaps for more discreet exits. A section of the ceiling that doesn't match repaired, after a patrol decided to inspect the rafters with a pole. And yet, here it is. Open. Again. That's the strange resilience of Ottoman coffeehouses. No matter how many times they were outlawed, they always returned. Like mushrooms after rain. The empire couldn't shake them. Couldn't unbrew what had already been steeped. Some say the very act of reopening was a kind of spiritual defiance. You watch now as an old man with trembling hands fills a tiny copper pot. He pours carefully, not just for flavor but as ritual. To make coffee is to declare, we are still here. That no decree, no patrol, no tax levy has managed to kill the craving for heat, for taste, for talk. It makes sense, really. For a state as vast and intricate as the Ottoman Empire, control was always a delicate illusion. You could rule with might, yes, with taxes, soldiers, and mandates. But you could never quite rule the invisible lines of friendship, of shared humor, of communal cups passed hand to hand in smoky twilight. That's why every reopening mattered, because it said, the world continues, the empire breathes, and the people still gather. There's a famous line often quoted in coffeehouses attributed dubiously to an unnamed vizier. Close every school if you must. But leave the cafes open. At least the people will still pretend to be wise. You smirk into your cup. There's something beautiful about the refusal of a culture to let go of its rituals, even when the consequences are real. This very cafe may have been shut down 3, 4, 10 times in its lifetime. And yet the cushions still remember where to crease. The coffee still remembers how to bloom. Someone in the corner begins to hum a tune older than anyone in the room. It's not a song, really. Just a melody, circular and slow, like water stirred with a wooden spoon. You sip and let your eyes drift toward the wall. Carved into the wood, almost invisible under the lacquer, are initials. Dozens. Hundreds. Each one a name, a visit, a silent promise I was here. I came back. The government might burn the sign, might find the owner, might even in rare moments arrest the storyteller. But they can't unmake the craving. They can't unspool the memory. And you're part of it now. Every time someone defied a ban by ducking into a friend's courtyard for a cup. Every time a shut cafe reopened under a new name with the same stools. Every time an old man poured quietly for his sons in the dark. They were all holding the line. This coffeehouse isn't just open tonight. It's surviving. And in that survival, it's winning. It starts with a whisper. Remove your shoes just as you stand to stretch your legs. Not shouted, not scolded. Just gently suggested, like someone reminding you not to drink water upside down. Still, it's enough to make your ears warm. You glance down and realize your right slipper crept a little past the mat's edge. A minor offense. A misstep, literal and social. And so begins your slow education in Ottoman coffeehouse etiquette. There are rules here not printed, not posted, but deeply felt. They're in the way people walk, the way cushions are arranged, the order in which pipes are passed, and even how much eye contact is too much for a first-time guest. These aren't written laws. They're rituals. And like any ritual, you break them at your peril, or at least your dignities. You shuffle back to your cushion, tucking your slippers neatly beside it. Immediately, a young man across the room gives you a small nod. You've corrected yourself. You're forgiven. This is a space of deep codes, and it starts from the top of your head. Let's talk turbans. Yes, turbans. The style, size, and angle of your turban speak volumes. Are you a scholar? Then your wrap is modest, tightly coiled, usually white or off cream. A bureaucrat. Yours might be broader with colored bands denoting rank or district. A tradesman or shopkeeper. Simpler, still sometimes even a cap instead of a full wrap. But you sitting here sipping coffee with your slightly wrinkled sash and your unremarkable wrap. You fall somewhere between scholar's cousin and competent assistant to a grain merchant. It's respectable. It says, I know my place. Don't try to fake a higher turban style. That's the first mistake of a fool or a spy. Historians still debate whether Ottoman dress codes were enforced by imperial decree or merely policed by social gravity. But one thing's certain, everyone noticed, and everyone judged quietly with eyebrows. Now to your feet. Shoes are always removed upon entering. That's obvious. But did you know the direction you place them matters? Toes must point outward away from the mat as if they too are politely waiting their turn outside. Slippers crossed haphazardly or turned inward. That's a red flag. A sign of carelessness, maybe even rudeness. Possibly foreign. One man in the corner, clearly irregular, takes great pride in aligning his slippers to an exact 45-degree angle before sitting. It's not showy. It's just who he is. And then there's the cushion. Cushion politics are fierce. Each cafe has its own unspoken map. Certain cushions are always occupied by certain men. Not reserved per se, there's no signage, but it's known. That far corner belongs to the retired customs official who never actually retired. That stool near the stove. The chess master sits there, always facing east. The rug near the window. That's communal, but only after dusk. You learn quickly not to sit just anywhere. And if you must say you're new or a guest, you wait a beat. Observe. See if anyone clears their throat. If you sit too fast, too confidently, someone might accidentally spill a drop of coffee near you as a warning. It's all very civil. Very Ottoman. Now comes tobacco. Not the leaf itself, but the pipe. The Nargile water pipe has its own etiquette. Never pass it hand to hand. Always set it down first. The pipe's mouthpiece should be wiped discreetly before and after use, not because of hygiene, though that's a bonus, but because it signals respect. It says, I acknowledge that this pipe, though shared, is still yours in spirit. Even the bubbling sound carries meaning. Too loud and you're seen as a bore. Too soft and you're wasting the coal. The sweet spot. Gentle, steady burbles like a cat purring into a basin. And don't even think about blowing smoke across someone's cushion. It's not just rude, it's war. Some cafe regulars go years without speaking more than a dozen words to each other, but they maintain whole relationships through cushion placement, pipe etiquette, and shared silences. It's a kind of ballet, one where every movement, every gesture, nod, cup placement is part of a quiet communal performance. Even sugar has rules. You're offered a lump or two with your coffee, but how you take it says everything. No sugar. You're a traditionalist, possibly a Sufi or someone watching his waistline. 1 lump practical. 2. A romantic or a poet, or perhaps just someone from the provinces. More than 2. Well, let's say you'll be watched. Closely. There's even a superstition that too much sugar dulls the tongue and weakens poetry. Whether it's true or not, no one wants to be the man blamed for a boring evening. You sip your coffee unsweetened and catch the faintest nod from the poet at the next mat. He approves. Then there's how you hold the cup. By the handle, acceptable. With 2 hands gently cupped, better. Cradled like it contains something sacred best. It's not about temperature. It's about reverence. A coffee house isn't a tavern. You don't chug. You don't gulp. You receive. The etiquette extends beyond objects. Even speech has rhythm. Don't interrupt a man mid-thought, even if he pauses for what seems like an entire verse. Don't rush to fill silences. They aren't gaps, they're part of the conversation. You realize now that this space, though bustling with movement and sound, operates on harmony. There's order shaped by years of shared habit and invisible lines. And you, just by being here, are learning its dance. Someone places a small plate of candied walnuts beside you. No one speaks. It's an invitation. You nod, take one, and pass the plate to the left. Proper direction. You've passed another quiet test. It's not about strictness, you understand. It's about rhythm. A cafe like this is a living instrument, and every slipper cushion puff of smoke and sip is part of its melody. Tonight you're learning the notes. You've grown comfortable here. Maybe too comfortable. You stretch your legs discreetly, of course, and let your hand rest lightly on the rim of your cooling cup. Around you, the energy of the coffee house has shifted again. Not sleepy, not energized, more like a lazy hum. The part of the night when nothing urgent needs to be said, and everything important has already been implied. But then, a sharp laugh bursts from the far end of the room. A younger man, barely past his teens, has said something bold, something daring enough to draw that dangerous sound from a nearby merchant. The kind of laugh that says, you don't know what you've stepped into. You catch the topic just in time, something about the kiosk class. You tilt your head curious. Not all coffeehouses, it turns out, are created equal. There are cafes like the one you're in, smoky, soft, ragwalled with worn cushions and the occasional cracked saucer. These are for the tradesmen, the poets, the watchers of the street. But then, there are others. The pavilions, the kiosks, the waterfront cafes with actual windows and velvet hangings and fig paste served on silver plates. And their patrons, silk-sashed bureaucrats, minor nobles, the sons of pashas who spend more on slippers than most people earn in a week. You've heard of them, of course. Everyone has. And everyone has an opinion. One man leans over and grumbles, they drink their coffee with rose syrup, and they call us indulgent. His neighbor smirks and adds, they don't even play backgammon. They debate which cloud pattern most resembles Aristotle's mood. You sense an undercurrent here, not just disdain, but class tension. The Ottoman Empire, vast and intricate, was built on layers, and while the ulama and the military held official power, the social web was complex. A merchant could be richer than a judge, a baker more influential than a minor official, but in the realm of presentation, the kiosk class always won. They arrived with scented handkerchiefs and literary opinions, quoting Persian poets between sips, and speaking of taste as though it were a hereditary virtue. They didn't slouch. They didn't shout. They didn't slurp. And they looked down on places like this. Of course, they'd never say it outright. That wasn't their style. But everyone knew. If they entered a working-class cafe, it was as a novelty. A social experiment. They'd sit in the corner flanked by guards or servants, make a few polite remarks, and leave without finishing their cup. One man across from you mutters, they call our grounds too thick. I say they're too afraid to chew their truth. The room chuckles. Still, the kiosk cafes had their allure. Located on hilltops or waterfronts, they offered breezes views. And if rumor is to be believed, discreet spaces behind silk screens for affairs both romantic and political. Historians still argue whether these elite cafes were hotbeds of real power or just stylish echo chambers. Some claim major appointments were decided over rosewater and sherbet. Others say they were little more than gossip dens with better furniture. But everyone agrees on one thing: they were expensive. Here, a cup of coffee costs a coin. There, it costs a performance. A display of refined indifference. A conversation in perfect Arabic. A quote from Rumi delivered with just the right sigh. You can't help but wonder what it would feel like to sit in one. To lean over a carved table beneath a silk awning, hear the Bosphorus lapping softly below, and pretend as they do that the world is stable and elegant and knows its place. But would it taste the same? You look down at your own cup, cracked on one side, the glaze faded. The coffee is a little overboiled tonight, maybe a touch gritty, but it's yours. And it was poured by someone who knows your name, or at least your slipper size. That means something. Still, the cafe owner who has returned to his spot near the stove notices the chatter. He doesn't interrupt, but he does adjust the seating slightly. Shifts a lamp, realigns the smoke. It's his way of keeping the room in balance. Because resentment, even in joke form, can tip the air. There's another layer to this. The kiosk cafes had influence, yes, but they also had eyes. Government ears often perched on their cushions, listening for hints of rebellion in polished tones. The elite could afford their secrets, but not their scandals. In contrast, cafes like this one offered anonymity. Here, your words weren't catalogued. They were swallowed by laughter, smudged by pipe smoke carried off by the draft from the street. That's its own kind of freedom. And it's why when revolutions whisper their first syllables, they don't begin in silk-draped balconies. They begin here, in rooms with mismatched cushions and coffee stains, among men who quote poetry not to impress, but because their father did, among Sufis who brew coffee as devotion, among tradesmen who laugh too loudly and poets who still don't get paid. You finish your cup. You've stopped thinking about the kiosk class. Their rose syrup and linen robes can stay on their hilltop. Here, your hands are stained with real grounds. And your cushion has remembered your shape. You're halfway through your third cup, though time has stopped keeping track. The coffeehouse breathes around you, less a building now, and more an organism pulsing with stories' warmth and the occasional gust of smoky laughter. You lean back, eyes resting on the painted wood above, where small decorative medallions glimmer like constellations from some long-forgotten night sky. And then you see them tucked into a shadowed corner, two miniature paintings framed behind thin glass, barely lit. You shuffle more. Bets. Putt closer, feigning interest in the stove. But really you're squinting at the frames. Tiny people, slender figures with exaggerated eyes, halos of brushstroke detail their movements frozen in vibrant colors. A man lifting a sezve, another lounging with a pipe, a third one almost comical slipping on a floor slick with spilled coffee. Miniatures. You weren't expecting art here, not like this. But these aren't mere decorations. These are stories. Echoes. And in the Ottoman world, miniature painting was more than aesthetic, it was memory made visible. Historians still argue whether these paintings in cafes were acts of flattery or subversion. Because on the surface, they celebrate daily life, but beneath the brushstrokes they observe. They critique. They whisper things that no poem would dare. You peer closer. One panel shows a row of turbaned men seated on identical cushions. All sipping, all silent. But one man's hand is beneath the cushion. Subtle, hidden. A detail you could miss unless you knew where to look. Another miniature shows a coffee vendor spilling a tray in front of a mosque. The mullah inside peers out the window frowning. But curious, the tray forms the shape of a lion's head. What does it mean? Courage, chaos, rebellion miniatures didn't explain themselves. They hinted. That's their genius. They were art, yes, but also surveillance. Documents. One brushstroke could say, look how refined we are. Another might say, see how tightly we're watched. And who painted them? Court artists. Trained illustrators. Some employed by sultans. Others by wealthy patrons. Still others by cafe owners themselves, hoping to immortalize their space in pigment and gold. A few were anonymous, their styles untraceable like ghosts with brushes. You sit back down and suddenly realize you're probably in a painting somewhere. Not you exactly, but this scene. This moment. Somewhere, someone has tried to trap this room in detail. The glint of the samovar, the curl of smoke, the slump of your shoulder. There's something oddly comforting about that. And also unsettling. Because miniature paintings, unlike written histories, show you everything. Not just the grand, but the mundane, the awkward, the uncomfortable. You remember hearing once that the Sultan's spies used paintings to gather gossip. An image of a cafe might hold a coded critique, a gesture misinterpreted, a symbol stitched into a rug. It wasn't just what was painted, it was why. And yet, these miniatures weren't banned. Not usually. In fact, in a stunning twist of imperial logic, the Ottomans preserved what they feared. They bound critiques in books. They stored scenes of coffeehouses, scenes just like this one in archives next to battle maps and royal decrees, as if to say, yes, we are powerful, but also, this is what our people really do. You wonder how many of those paintings still survive, tucked away in libraries, hung crooked in cafes, clutched by collectors who understand only half the meanings. And maybe that's the magic. Because here in this coffeehouse, everything is layered. The cushion you sit on is a story. The pipe someone smokes is a lineage. And the miniature painting on the wall, it's both mirror and trap. It flatters you, but it also watches. You suddenly imagine this whole night as a painting. The frame tight. The faces flat but expressive. The light, exaggerated gold brushing the tips of turbans, the floor slick with oil and reflection. And in the corner, almost hidden, you eyes half-lidded cup in hand, caught forever in the quiet between sips. What would they say about you? Were you a thinker? A dreamer? A foreigner out of place? or just another background figure in the great Ottoman pageant of tea and talk. The boy brings you another cup. You didn't ask, but of course, you never do anymore. You sip slowly, and as you do, your eyes drift to the paintings once more. Now you notice a third miniature. Newer, slightly off in color, less refined. It shows a cafe just like this one. And above the door, painted in fine detail, are 3 letters. Tiny but unmistakable AEM. You ask around. No one admits to knowing who the artist is, but a young man shrugs and says, "He comes sometimes." Sits in the back. Draws with fingers stained darker than his coffee. You nod. Somewhere someone is still painting these stories, still freezing them in time, because the coffee house may rise and fall open and close, bloom and burn, but the miniatures remain. A witness, a wink, a quiet brushstroke that says, "This happened. We were here. We sipped. We spoke." The night is deep now, so deep that even the shadows seem to stretch out and yawn. The oil in the lamps is burning low, and the coals under the stove no longer glow red, just a faint memory of heat nestled in gray ash. But no one moves to leave. It's not just stubbornness. It's inertia. When you've been steeped in coffee story and smoke for hours, movement feels like betrayal. Across from you, 2 older men have settled into a rhythm of their own. One strokes his beard thoughtfully, while the other gently fans his pipe's embers with a folded napkin. They aren't speaking, but they've been communicating all night. Still in the far left corner, almost hidden behind a faded curtain, there's a quiet conversation underway. You can't hear every word, but you catch just enough to follow the thread. They're talking about love. No. Wait. Hashish, yes. Not scandalously. Not with hushed tones or darting eyes. Just casually, like one might discuss the price of fish or the weather on the Black Sea. It's not that everyone in here approves exactly, but in this cafe, such things are acknowledged. Realities, not revelations. Ottoman coffeehouses were places where the forbidden flirted with the familiar, where a man might confess his heartbreak in one breath and question the morality of taxation in the next. Because when the lights grow dim and the night stretches long, people stop pretending to care only about politics or poetry. They speak of more personal things, messier things. That's when the real talking starts. Someone nearby murmurs about a lost friend. Another talks about a marriage that never happened because of a cousin's bad business decision. You catch the word betrayal, and then forgiveness, and then never again. This is what the sultans feared. Not insurrection, but connection. Because connection leads to questions. And questions lead to unrest, not necessarily the kind with torches and shouting, but the kind that starts with, "Wait, why are things this way?" Historians still debate whether coffeehouses were true incubators of revolution or merely mirrors of public thought. But you can feel it. Tonight, in this room, that what's said here isn't always what it seems. You tune back into the corner. Conversation. They're now on to more philosophical ground. The nature of truth, of dreams. One man jokes, "The only honest moment in my day is when the coffee's too hot to drink, and I stop lying just long enough to wait." His companion laughs, not because it's funny, but because it's too true. You find yourself wondering what the Grand Vizier would think of this place. Not the structure, but the mood, the muttered asides, the gentle sighs between sentences, the half-remembered poems recited not to impress but to soothe. He'd probably send a report, summon someone, demand a tax audit. But even he in his marble chamber would long for this ease. Because this is where people say what they really think. And what do they talk about? Everything. There's a long-standing joke in the empire that the coffeehouse contains 5 professions: judge, poet, spy, lover, and ghost. And often one man plays all 5. You're starting to understand why. You overhear a debate, light, playful, but pointed about whether the empire should standardize weights in the provinces. It drifts into a tangent about bakers and then into a story about a donkey that refused to cross a bridge because it smelled too much like vinegar. Everyone laughs, but beneath the joke, the original argument still simmers. That's how cafes worked. No one argued here. Not really. They danced, circled, posed questions disguised as anecdotes, countered opinions with unrelated proverbs. The truth, if it came out at all, emerged like coffee came slow, hot, and muddy at the bottom. A man across the room quotes a Sufi mystic. If the cup is clean, the truth will reflect. If it is cracked, the truth will seep. Someone raises a toast with an empty cup. No one questions it. A boy, the youngest you've seen all night, leans over to ask the man beside him why women weren't allowed into the coffee house. The elder strokes his beard and replies, "Because we say too many foolish things. They'd never let us forget." The boy laughs, but he also nods. He understands something changed in that answer. You realize then that every hour in a coffee house is like a chapter in a book no one will write. Each laugh, each quote, each whispered confession will be forgotten by morning, but they'll shape something. Something soft. Something permanent. Maybe that's the greatest irony. The empire built walls, mosques, forts, and fountains. But what truly endured were the stories muttered over cups and smoke. And the understanding that for all their laws and decrees, some truths could only be spoken in shadow, in quiet between strangers who understood silence better than speech. You catch the end of a story, something about a man who once left the city to escape his debts, only to find that the village he fled to had even worse coffee. He came back the next week, paid off his debt, just to return to the cafe. It's funny. It's also true. And so, you sip and listen and speak less. Because the later it gets, the more sacred the words become. The stove is nearly cold now. The coals have faded to quiet gray like the last page of a book that was once aflame. The boy with the tray has stopped making rounds. Even the pipes have gone still. Their bubbling lulls silenced beneath ash and breath. You are still here. And the coffee house impossibly is quieter than ever, but not silent. Never silent. There's the faint creak of the wood, the soft breath of wind teasing a lantern, the rhythmic shift of fabric as someone stands, bows slightly, and slips into the night. You don't want to move. Not because you're tired, though you are, but because moving would shatter something delicate. A stillness that's been earned. Built sip by sip, word by word, through hours of smoke story ritual. You glance at the men who remain. They're fewer now, but familiar. The poet by the stove leans into his cushion chin. On chest beard, like a question mark. The janissary has vanished. No one saw him leave, but no one needed to. That's how they exit. Like punctuation at the end of an argument no one admits they had. The Sufi from earlier has returned to humming. Not the full chant now, just a slow breath of melody that hovers barely there like the steam off a forgotten cup. You are warm. You are still. You are part of the furniture now. And so is the memory. The cafe has settled into its last form, the sanctuary of those who do not wish to go home yet. Not because home is bad, but because this is still holding something. A thread of thought. A lingering joke. A silence that means more than any sentence. It's in this hour that the coffee house reveals its final truth. It isn't really about coffee. Coffee was the door, the password, the scent that called people to gather. But what they truly came for was this. A place to think without speaking. A place to hear without responding. A place where your presence, your mere presence, is enough. You let your eyes drift to the corner where earlier the miniature paintings hung. One is dim now, the lantern beside it almost out. But you remember it. The frozen scene. The man leaning back just like you. The cup, the half smile. It wasn't just a painting. It was a mirror. And as you sit watching this moment fade into nothing, you begin to realize that Ottoman coffeehouses weren't built to be remembered as institutions. They were designed to vanish nightly and be rebuilt the next day in the same breath, with the same cup, the same cushion, the same sigh. A ritual of rebirth. Burn the coals, brew the pot, begin again. You will leave soon. You'll step into the street where the air smells of stone and history. Your legs will feel like memory foam pressed into marble. The sky will be paler than you expected. And the birds will have begun to stir as if they too overheard something in the cafe that kept them up a little too long. But before that, one last sip. You raise your cup, empty now. But that's all right. The grounds clump at the bottom like a tiny continent. You could read them if you wanted. Could swirl the future out of them. But you don't. You simply tilt your head, smile, and whisper, "Thank you." Not to anyone in particular, just to the room, to the stove, the boy, The rhythm, the rules, the mistakes, the stories, the coffee that was never truly about coffee. You rise. You step gently. Your slippers are right where you left them, neatly placed, toes pointing outward. A small victory. A quiet farewell. And just before you exit, you look back once. The cafe doesn't wave, doesn't blink, but somehow it nods. You have been folded into its memory. And it into yours. Now the stove is dark and the cushion behind your back has just the faintest warmth left, like a memory you can still feel, but can't quite touch. The voices that once filled the room are silent now, and even the echo of the last joke has curled up and gone to sleep. You stand slowly, stretching your arms without sound. The heavy air of the coffeehouse clings to your clothes, the scent of old books of roasted beans of time. Outside, the sky has turned from black to the lightest gray, a soft veil draped gently over the minarets. The call of the muezzin is not far off. But for now, there is only stillness. The world has not changed. Not much. The empire still stands. The streets are still slick with dew, and the little shop at the corner still needs new lantern oil. But you are just a little different now. You carry something with you. A rhythm, a memory. The quiet knowledge that somewhere tucked into an alley of stone and smoke, a room like this waits for someone to sit, to sip, to speak, or not. Let your eyes close gently. Let the night wrap around your shoulders like a robe left warming by the fire. Let the last echoes of spoon on cup and breath on pipe fade into silence. Sleep now. You've traveled far without leaving your cushion.